when things are spatialized, they're put under the domain of the eye that marshals everything within its gaze, seeks to control it, but also seeks to be detached from it, to stand over against it, to see it as a world that it can look at without being influenced by it. Now, that's a very modern view of how sight works, but that's very often how the modern mind thought about time and the eye and the world.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings, this is the Anadromist, Byrne Power, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. And today we've got another in our series of Anadromist dialogues with biblical scholar and theologian Alastair Roberts. And it was quite an interesting conversation covering subjects like how to interpret the Bible, the nature of time and spatial things, meaning, how to the sense of texture, why the world has suddenly become, well, not suddenly, but has progressively become such a thin place as opposed to being a thick place full of glorious reality. So without any further ado, well, actually, let's do a little further ado here. Have you subscribed to the channel yet? If you like this, if you like these dialogues, do subscribe, hit like, that helps people find this algorithmically. Make a comment if you wish down below, and or just to say hello, say it's nice to know people are watching. And let's see. Okay, well, let's just go. Greetings.
Hello.
Good.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through fine.
Excellent.
And I take it I'm coming through as well?
Perfectly clearly.
Yeah, probably a little fuzzy. I'm working with just a computer camera, so webcam or whatever it is. So, yeah. So, well, it's good to finally meet you. I've heard about you. I think I first ran across one of your lectures that you gave at New St. Andrews. Someone sent it to me.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, this was back in, I think, late 2018, and you were talking about Jordan Peterson, and they knew that I was interested in him, so they sent me a copy of your lecture, which I thought was well-balanced, more than I had a right to expect at the time. I think I had just discovered Paul Vanderklay's channel, or it was right around the same time. But so, yeah. And I've been following what you've been up to with your, well, before we go too far, let me tell you a little bit about the kind of people I get on my channel. I do get Christians. I get some who are Orthodox curious. I get some who are self-confessedly Calvinist. I get, because I've been putting on kind of reconfiguring the lectures of Hans Rookmacher. I've been getting Dutch Christians as well. Also, I get people who are not Christians at all, or people who are weighing things, and of course I just get I make a variety of videos, and get people who will just show up for a certain subject, and if they're not too frightened away by whatever it is they find, they look around. So I thought it would be good if you introduced yourself a little bit and maybe give a little of your personal and theological, just whatever background you think might appeal to kind of a diverse audience like that.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, I was raised in the Republic of Ireland.
Okay.
I spent the first 16 years of my life in Clonmel, County Tipperary, as the only Protestant among my peers in most contexts, which was an interesting experience. But the Republic of Ireland at that time was a very strongly Catholic place, but was rapidly changing through a number of crises and scandals, child abuse, political intrigue, things like that. I moved over to the UK at the age of 16 and settled in Stoke-on-Trent, where I'm now based again. But since then, I've spent time in St Andrews, in Durham, and also spent some time earlier in South Wales. My parents, growing up, they were church planting. My dad's a pastor.
What kind of church?
Retired. Reformed Baptist.
Mm-hmm. And so, what is a Reformed Baptist? That is to say, I detect the Reformed Calvinist tradition and Baptist, whereas in America, you can get a variety of kinds of Baptists. How would you describe that?
So Reformed Baptist, certainly in terms of the church that I was brought up in, is broadly within the evangelical Protestant tradition. It is one of the groups that falls into the category of churches under the there's three confessions that are very similar to each other: the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith, the Savoy Declaration of Faith, and then the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the one that most people would know. And ours was the 1689. It was a small church, very traditional hymns, emphasis upon the expository preaching of Scripture and thinking about Scripture deeply and broadly. But my dad has always been someone who's hard to nail down within the particular tradition that he comes from. He's always been someone who encourages wide and voracious reading.
Yeah.
He had a library.
So learning was very important.
Very, and exposing yourself to ideas beyond your immediate setting and theological context. So through that, I came in contact with ideas which led me away from a Reformed Baptist context. I'm more Anglican now in my convictions, but I'm still attending my parents' church as I'm living near to them. And I think there are, when I'm choosing a church, a number of things that I prioritize. Proximity, being somewhere where people are a faithful community, where they'll be praying for you, you'll worship together and have fellowship together, people with whom you're living your life on a daily basis. I think it's important to prioritize worshiping with them. So I'm worshiping and a member of that church, but my theological convictions lean more to the Anglican side nowadays. As for my theological formation, at a very young age, I came to a personal confession of faith. I was baptized on confession of faith at the age of 15, and then spent a number of years going backsliding and doing my own thing, losing my way a bit, making that transition from a childlike faith to the faith of a teenager and young adult. And so that period was a very difficult time for me, of long-term illness and also of struggling to find some way to answer some big questions that were being forced upon me by conversations that I was having with cult groups, with the wider society that I was being exposed to, going to university and things like that. And as I wrestled with those, I found that studying theology in depth was a very rewarding and deepening experience for me. So I was studying philosophy and theology alongside each other, getting into people like Cornelius von Til and others, and trying to understand how to think about the world in a Christian way. Mm-hmm. And then through that, I came in contact with the work of a certain James Jordan, who has a rather strange approach to Scripture, or at least it seemed that way at first. So I read his Through New Eyes, the first few pages, put it to one side. I just didn't find it persuasive. Returned to it a few months later, and suddenly it clicked. Mm-hmm. And since then,
what was that approach?
The approach is a more symbolic approach to biblical to the biblical world, to think about symbolism, typology more seriously, to recognize that the sort of modern ways that we view the world are not the ways that the Bible presents itself. And so the sorts of questions that we bring to the text are often alien ones. And we almost have to suspend our questions and imaginatively enter into the world of the text if we're going to find the sort of guidance that we want and we need.
Right.
And so that was an incredibly rewarding and stretching experience for me. And it's been a constant spur to my own studies since. My hope through my work and from very early on has been to encourage people to read the Bible more deeply, to enter into its imaginative world and to begin to see their own world in terms of the biblical framework that is presented to us, to recognize, for instance, the importance of typology in Scripture, the way that the stories of Scripture are told to us in a way that shows their unity, the providential work of God that connects them all, and their terminus on Christ as the one who fulfills them. And so the story of Scripture is something to be meditated upon. And as we meditate upon it, it forms us, and it forms us into the image of the one of whom it tells us.
Right.
And that experience of Scripture has been one that has been very much at the heart of my own spiritual development.
Right.
And it's one that I want to share with others.
Well, good. Yeah, I had a similar... my Christian upbringing is very different in that, I did become a Christian also at the age of 15, but through the Jesus movement in California. And the group that I became a Christian through ends up being pretty much the ground zero group that it then kind of circulated throughout the rest of California and throughout as far as it spread. But then later, I would say I took a very, I don't know if fundamentalist is the right word, but we'll say a conservative position on Scripture. But some of it was, I would say, based on some of the prejudices of the evangelical world at the time, although we were a bit outside of that for quite a while. But it was through my friend John Sandry, whom I met at L'Abri, and I have a couple of interviews with him, one where he just talks about his ideas about the biblical text and how to study them. And he was very much, he said, you cannot understand them without understanding the context. And you simply can't, one thing that a lot of people do is they'll take, they'll want to come up with some sort of eschatological viewpoint. So they'll take a scripture from Daniel and another one from Matthew and then one from Revelation, maybe a little Ezekiel. Paul said this, crunch it all together. And he was just like, I just want to know what each book says, what each letter says in context, because they're not random. They are put together in a literary form to say that they have a structure. And first you have to understand what's going on in those before you can move on. Later, also, I came across the work of Hans Ruckmacher, who didn't talk about his biblical interpretation that much, but I read more of it later when his complete works were released. And then also the work of Owen Barfield was important to me, because what I saw through him is that, for instance, when you go back in time, the whole nature of words changes, and you get back into these, how the cliched example is spirit and breath, but both in Hebrew and in Greek, as I'm sure you know, they each have these multiple meanings of breath and spirit and wind. And how when they spoke, all of those were they were thicker words in a sense. And we speak, and this was Barfield's point, we speak thinner words. Our words tend to be more pragmatic and practical. And I think that it's good that we are beginning to question some of the, in a sense, what happened, I think, with the modernist fundamentalist split was the fundamentalists actually took on an aspect of modernism to say that, each word well, that's King James Bible, but each word was like a photograph, and I have friends. I remember meeting some people I knew in Alaska who were young Earth Seventh Day creationists, and I was like, really? I hadn't met one for quite a while, but in a sense, it goes along with that. And although, how do you see what's going on with this kind of orthodox situation? Also, on top of that, a little different than that is Jonathan Pageau's symbolism. I know you have connections with him, and I think you know him. And so what is your feeling about these kinds of things?
Yes, I think when we're reading the scripture, the challenge is always, people often talk about being committed to scripture, and they talk about having a high view of scripture. And often what they're committed to is not actually the text so much as a particular preconception about what the text is. They're committed to their doctrine of scripture, which is not the same thing as the actual text. And so my concern has been to have a high doctrine of scripture, but my commitment to scripture is primarily the fact that I'm going to pay it incredibly close attention. And one of the things that I think that leads us to is an understanding of just how anachronistic our categories for viewing the world can be, and having to work through the ways in which we approach the text in our world, to unpack some of those, to recognize where they came from, and to go back to understand, for instance, how does a sacrificial system make sense? What sort of world is presupposed by that? And what you describe of Owen Barfield is the sort of world that starts to make sense of these analogies between human beings and animals, the way in which a whole human society and its relationships and its movements in relationship to God can be mapped on to the movements of animals and the ways that they're connected to certain pieces of furniture, certain actions performed upon them, where their blood is deposited, these sorts of things. And I've found the work of Barfield very helpful too. I recently enjoyed reading Susanna Clarke's novel, Piranesi, which is kind of a mixture of Barfield and Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. It brings the two of them together in some wonderful ways.
Yeah, along with
that view of the world, I think there's what I've described as a strangeness to the modern mind.
Oh, exactly.
And something of what I think the Pageau brothers, both of them, are trying to do is to recapture something of the fundamental symbolic character of the world. And so whether that's thinking about the furniture of the world, how do trees symbolize particular things? And as you look in scripture, you'll see trees connected with altars so often, trees connected with ladders to heaven, trees connected with human beings, the righteous, or connected with rulers. They're symbols of the temple at certain points. And so when you attend to these, the world of the scripture becomes a far more vibrant and symbolic place. When you encounter one of these entities, you recognize the text is not just telling us about this for the purpose of verisimilitude. It wants us to enter into a symbolic world where water, where wells, where trees, where stones, where all these things have deep resonance and connection with other things, and maybe to learn along the way how to view our own world differently.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this problem. In Hans Rookmacher's lecture, What is Reality? He at the end of the lecture, he basically has talked about two views of reality. And one is a view in which the heart is the center of the being, in which water is life, but it's so much more. And then at the end he says, so the big question is, what is water? Is it the smelly little canal in Amsterdam? Is it the waves on the ocean? Is it the rain in your face? Is it the drink given to the thirsty? And then he says, and we say with science, is it H2O? And so many people have, in a sense, lived in this world, the H2O world, in which there are no symbols. It simply is. And the more I've thought about it, various things have come to me. One relates to the subject of time, and that is to say that this hardened scientific mentality goes against living in time. So that, and I think this was an accident that Galileo and Copernicus and all the, even Descartes and certainly Pascal, all the earlier scientists didn't have a problem with living in time, because they were asking questions. And what happened, particularly with Descartes and Galileo, is they were in love with weighing and measuring and what could be understood in a material sense. And they knew there was something else. I don't think either of them had a problem with that. But what happened was, as time went on, this weighing and measuring left out things. And what it left out was, it left out everything that, as I see it, wasn't in the category of time. So, for instance, it starts off with God. We can't, not that God is simply in time, but that he comes to us through time. And things in the category of time are like truth. You know, you have an image come to you, but what is it really? For instance, if I go to a church, and I've been to churches like this when I was younger, where everyone is just like completely filled with the Spirit and singing in tongues and all of this, and you walk out like you got to peel yourself off the ceiling. Well, what is the truth of that event? The image of it is one thing, but to describe the truth takes time. Love takes time, because you can't just simply love someone just like that. Evil seems to break relationships in time. And in fact, it's relationships that become the core. And I'm not going to go into my whole time thing. I did a whole series on that. But what I came to ultimately was God reveals himself, particularly in the first verses of Genesis and later in the first verses of John, as the Logos. But it's the wind, the Spirit, the breath. It's the speaking into it. And the Logos, because God is Trinity, is not a static thing, but rather it is it forms relationships within God that we don't understand. But nevertheless, this is what God seems to have revealed to us. And the more you look at the world around us, I think science has finally gotten to the point where there are certain things we can be humble about now. And one of those things is the more you look at, I think it's in chaos theory, which doesn't say the world is in chaos, but says rather there are things beyond what we can know. Like if you watch water going over a waterfall, you will never see the same two ripples twice. It'll never be the same, but yet you recognize the pattern. Same with clouds, same with fire, same with dirt. These things are beyond our ability to understand because there's just too much going on. And on the other end, the further we look into the world and you get to the subatomic realm and you get down to the quarks and gluons and all the things beneath the protons and electrons, it isn't, and I've heard people often say, well, we're nothing. We're just atoms. And I'm going like, no, what we are is the ultimate answer isn't that we are matter or even energy, but the answer is what keeps these things in orbit around each other? What keeps my body from disintegrating into a pile of atoms? There are relationships in everything. And I think once you start to see that, everything starts to change. That is to say, we're no longer living in a dead world. We're living in a full world. And it is our relationship to pretty much everything that is so important. So when I look at what's one thing that was interesting, I think was an information theory. One of the more recent theories from about 10, 20 years ago was that they said the thing, matter, energy, comes from bit, the smallest unit. That is to say, before you even have the atoms, you have the code, the thing that keeps them moving. And we, the materialist world of the modern world, tended to see that we were just matter. But now I think the more you understand it, for instance, I'm not DNA. And it was Michael Polanyi who says that one of the big problems was to try to explain the greater by the lesser. So I am I am largely made out of water, but I am not defined by water, except in moments when it gets too hot or too cold, or there's not enough, or the water is poisoned or something like that. Or, I get my daily liquid, and if I get the wrong kind too much, that can be a problem. But generally, these words we're speaking can't be defined at all by water, but nor can they be defined by DNA. He says instead, the greater thing defines the lesser thing. So in fact, we wouldn't even know about H2O if the greater thing, my brain, not mine, but somebody's, was able to put it together. So in other words, his idea is, what's the most complex thing we know? Well, us, for one thing, but we also know that the interaction with everything is much greater. And I would say that God has to be personhood, in a sense, be more than me, but in a sense, way beyond me. And so all of these things, I think, point to a good possibilities and understanding. And the fact that these questions are coming up, even though this is a dark time for politically, I think there are potentials here that we haven't seen until recently. Would you concur with that, or how would you see it?
Yes, very much. I think this is, again, something that the Pageaus have really given a lot of attention to, the way that symbol and matter relate to each other. And that, for instance, if you're trying to understand a painting, you're not going to understand it primarily by looking at what it's composed of, the small elements of it. You have to step back and see the order that has been placed upon those different material elements. And in the same way with speech, meaning is not something that lies primarily at the level of matter taken by itself. If you took all the different sounds that I'm making as I'm speaking and mixed them up and tried to make sense of that, there would be no sense to be made. It would be incoherent. But when they're expressed in an articulate way in a particular order, it does make sense. And, well, hopefully it makes sense. And in the same way with our world, I think that tendency to reduce things to matter is something that excludes things that are essential, the most important things to our lives. And you give the example of water. There are many ways in which water functions, for instance, in scripture, that it's a very primal symbol, like fire or like earth and wind, as well as you mentioned with the connection with the spirit. Water is something that can be a symbol of washing and of cleansing. It can be a symbol of the realm of the deep in which you might be drowned, the realm from which things emerge and to which things sink down. It can be a symbol of the blessing of the rain that comes down upon us. And so when we're practicing baptism, it's drawing upon all of those different aspects of the symbolism, and it's intervolving us with those. We can't escape our entanglement with these realities because it's not just matter. It's matter in these significant, meaningful ways, like different phonemes within a sentence, the way in which they come together to make something meaningful on the level of the sentence, not necessarily on the level of the matter composing it. And the challenge that I think we often have within the modern world is to recapture something of the instinctive sense of that. And we can reason ourselves to it, but I think so often we have a sense of alienation from the world, and that's in part bequeathed to us from modernity. It's not something that we've entirely gotten beyond. So I found someone like E.A. Burt's The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science very helpful in getting at some of the metaphysical notions that informed Descartes or Galileo or Copernicus and Kepler, these other figures who shaped our view of the universe, but could often do so in a way that rendered us strangers to all those things that are most important in understanding our world. So the things that really matter in understanding our world are things that can be weighed and measured, things that can be registered mathematically. And as a result, all these things that render humanity salient within the world are seen as secondary, accidental, things that don't really have a true home. Now, many of these philosophers and scientists had a sense, as you say, of something beyond, but the pursuit of that particular way of looking at the world can lead to a narrowing that blinds us to so much of what is important about our world and our relationship to it. And as we think about the world at that level of information, for instance. So as we think about it in terms of its fundamental existence, or the way in which things have natures, whatever it is, I think the way that Aquinas and others explored these in giving different arguments for the existence of God, or different ways of seeing the rationality of believing in God, I think we can recapture something of that just in a phenomenological appreciation of the world in which we live. I've appreciated the work of the writer Pierre-Marie Eminet, God's Seen in the Mirror of the World, and other books like that, where he explores Aquinas' 5 ways from the perspective of fundamental senses of lack, the ways in which we see the limits of our capacity as human beings and as created beings, and from that are able to recognize almost the need for a being that satisfies or is not afflicted by that lack of finitude that's characteristic of our finitude in the sense of being creatures. And as we reflect upon the existence of God as it's revealed to us in Scripture, I think we have something that is intellectually and philosophically compelling as an explanation of these things that do give meaning to our lives and our world. That love, for instance, or the idea of places and things as having particular significance, not just being defined as resources that we can exploit, but they matter in their specific orientation and their specific configurations within the world. That is something that we can come to through an understanding of the existence of God. And I think we struggle with this for other reasons as well. I mean, if we look at our surroundings in most contexts, 90% of what surrounds us is mass-produced in a way that things are orphaned objects. We don't have a sense of their relationship to the deep presence of nature and the way in which that connects us to it. I was discussing some stuff with Jake Meadle yesterday, where in his book, he talks about his recent book, he talks about the experience of people within the older world, where they could look to the mountains, and on the mountains, they'd see the fields that had sustained their ancestors for generations going back. That gives a sense of one's entanglement and connection to the world, and the world as a source of life that is very strange and foreign to us. But it's nearer to the truth of the world, and the world as a realm of God's bounty. And as you say, with time, I think there's also, when things are spatialized, they're put under the domain of the eye that marshals everything within its gaze, seeks to control it, but also seeks to be detached from it, to stand over against it, to see it as a world that it can look at without being influenced by it. Now, that's a very modern view of how sight works, but that's very often how the modern mind thought about time and the eye and the world. And yet time is something that we cannot fully grasp things. Things arrive at us through time. And even when we're reading texts, we can forget this. We can spatialize texts. We talk about context, thinking about something that's just elsewhere on the page, without thinking that context is often something that's unfolding. And so when we're listening to a poem, often you'll find you have part of the way that the poem means and works is by leading you to your mind to draw certain associations that are later corrected or chastened or changed or transformed in some way. And so it's that movement and arrival through time that gives you a sense of the non-controlled source of being, the gift of reality, and also of its transcendent source.
And one of the things I've been doing over the years related to this kind of thing is I think about the images that show up and when they show up. So one of the things I'll probably do a video on, people have been asking because I've mentioned it before, but it's the idea, we are surrounded in our cultures now by very strange artistic images of big-eyed creatures that are cute, which suggests baby-likeness. So people don't critique these things. And yet, one day, I was just a few years back, I started looking and seeing these things everywhere. There was one in a post office in Alaska made by the federal government. And I'm saying, why are these things here? What happened? Is this what's beyond postmodernism? That is to say, this strange view of humanity. And then you see people will make an image of themselves looking like one of these big-eyed creatures and use it as an avatar on their social media site. And I said, so you're seeing yourself that way now. And I think we are surrounded by things now that, we have the illusion, like you were saying, about being over and against and above the things we see, that we can somehow visually categorize these things, that we understand them. I think, for instance, propaganda and advertising would argue that we don't really understand because there are forces greater than us. But there are things that we find ourselves losing within society. And I think in America, we've lost more of certain kinds of things than I find in Europe. I'm living in the Republic of Georgia now, in Tbilisi, and there's so much texture and age within things. And even the older I'm living in a Soviet building now, made in 1956. So it's still close to Stalin's death, and it was overbuilt. That is to say, the walls are all about 1.5 feet thick. And it's about 0.5 meter for my European and the rest of the world friends. Absolutely amazing. Later, they would go on to make these cheap Khrushchevkas that would be multiple stories on very unusual buildings that I hope to get around to talking about someday. But one thing that's hit me, one of the things I study is puppets. And the reason I study puppets is because when I look around at arts that lean against our digital kind of obsessions, puppetry is something you have to really experience in flesh is the wrong word, but in material reality, in physical being. And as such, they do something, as a puppeteer friend said to me many years ago, when in 2005, there was the internet, and there were the promise of interactivity. And he said, no. Guignol, the little French puppet, that's interactivity. And he would show me how he would talk with the children, and they would all respond live there. It was happening. Recently, I've been taking photographs of dancers, and there's a dance troupe here that does some very interesting, not super modern, well, in a way, modern dancing, but they're also classically trained dancers as well. And the more I look at them, the more I realize this is another art form that, more and more has been lost, and it's holding on. I mean, I was saying, why do these people dance? No one will ever know who they are, and their careers will come and go with it. Fortunately, in Georgia, more people are really appreciative of dance than they are back in my home of America. But what struck me was, to really understand dance, you can watch a video, just like you can watch a puppet video, but it won't hit you the way it will at all without seeing it in physical space, in physical time, unfolding before you. There's something going on there. And because I've been studying puppetry, one of the things that really struck me several years back, but this has been something that's been coming at me from a long time, is the texture of the puppets. Now, the Muppets in America are very plush. They're these like toys, essentially. Whereas a lot of the older puppets made out of wood or made out of cloth
have scary.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's what they are to us now. Just as this is another thing. The word creepy is often used to discuss almost anything that used to be handmade, like a mask for Halloween, or certain kinds. And you will see people sharing these photos of people 100 years ago wearing their mask, and people go like, oh, that's just so creepy. And I'm going like, but you live in a world of mass-produced grotesques, where you have you don't consider that horror film in the same light. You don't consider the new Halloween mask that might be in the configuration of some movie franchise. You don't consider that to be scary. You don't consider the big-eyed anime character to be scary, but you do consider these old handmade things from the past to be scary, which said to me that it's texture. And a couple of years ago, I was at the International Puppetry Institute in Charleville-Mézières in France. And I had been given some time there, and I was doing some research on texture in puppets. But then I just started doing research on texture, and they have a nice library for these sorts of things. And I thought I was going to find lots of books on the subject. And then I discovered, except for perhaps in cloth and fabric, there are almost no books on the subject. And I thought, oh, that's really strange. I ended up giving a lecture at Le Brie in Switzerland on it because I was so fascinated by the fact. I said, why are there no books on it? Because we desperately need it. We live in these, flat, monolithic structures. It's like everything's a square box. There's no, there's no beauty put into things. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, the reason there are no books on the subject is because most people have never noticed it. It's slowly disappearing. But you can see that distance when you do something like show people, pictures of carnivals from the past, pictures of toys from the past, pictures of puppets from the past. Then they all start feeling like there's something wrong there because there's too much texture. And I think that texture goes beyond spatialization. There's an artist, Jan Schwankmeyer, who's also a puppet filmmaker, who makes these boxes as part of his art where you stick your hand in. He makes the boxes as portraits of people. And so you stick your hand in, you don't know what's in there. And he will have dangerous substances. You've got to be you can't just stick your hand in. You'll also have gooey substances in there, but what it is that he recognized that we don't understand touch anymore because, we're sitting here doing this. What do we understand now about the outside world? And I think that many of our problems today are coming from this abstraction that we are living. I really appreciate meeting you, but I really hope someday to actually meet you in the flesh.
Yep.
So
I think it's interesting you talk about texture because I imagine texture has never received more attention than it is receiving at the moment, but from a very weird perspective. We're thinking about how to replicate texture in virtual forms.
Exactly.
And so to escape the sort of uncanny valley of things that look unreal because they don't have the right textures or appearance of textures, really. It's not textures, it's just the some sort of simulation of it. And that struggle, I think, says a lot about how we've lost something with the concept of texture, maybe something of the friction of reality and the way in which it presents an obstacle to us. And virtual images are just a bit too easy. Think about the hyper stimulating images of the wide eyes that kind of play to all our feelings about childhood. Mm-hmm. You can have Baby Yoda, for instance, that image, which it has very clearly been developed in order to kick off all those deep instincts about how we react to neotenous faces. And the challenge, I think, is to get back to something of the friction of a reality that resists us in various ways, where we have the experience of touching grass, as some call it, the sense of a reality that does not come at our beck and call, but can surprise us, can give us, as we move with it and as we relate to its textures, it can genuinely surprise us. It is not something that allows us just to slip into it and slip it onto us in a way that enables us to identify with it so easily as we can with our avatars and the other ways in which we seek to identify ourselves online in a realm where there's images don't push back to us. There's a control that we have within virtual space over that spectacle that is far greater than any control that we have over physical objects. Mm-hmm. One thing I've always enjoyed doing is I knit. Often I knit when I'm recording podcasts.
Okay.
Mere Fidelity, things like that, because I like working with fabrics.
Mm-hmm.
I like the experience of using my hands to create something physical in the world that has a feel and a texture to it and a shape to it. And I can give it to someone as a physical token of my concern for them and also the time that I've put into it. And that has a weight and a gravity to it that no virtual object can have.
Yeah.
And yet people are trying to recover something of that in the strangest ways of all, when the sort of non-fungible tokens and things like that.
Very strange.
Trying to get something of the uniqueness of a physical object. We're trying to recapture texture. We're trying to recapture all these different things, but within a realm that's just a simulation that cuts us off from these things which we can experience in reality in ways that can surprise and wrong-foot us often. And there, I think it gets into some of the issues that you were raising, that this is a way of forming the self, that the self is formed in different ways in different ages. And that's one of the things I always found the most stimulating about Barfield, the idea that ancient people just were different sorts of selves, and not because of not necessarily because of the division of the bicameral mind or whatever, those sorts of theories, that people can raise those debates, but it's not necessarily on that sort of level that there's been some evolution or shift, but just the way that we relate to the world through language, through our relationship to physical objects, to the way that speech and world interface.
Right.
And the modern world has been formed in large part through the development of print, where you move away from the sort of agonism and the combative character of speech and the active character of speech to latent words upon the page that encourage you to objectify and to take things outside. So if you're trying to think about the development of modern literature, much of it has developed its psychological richness through the objectification of the self in writing and in print, where selves are encouraged to write spiritual diaries, to write reflections upon their thoughts and feelings, and as a result, to have a far richer and more articulated inner self. And in some ways, you can think of other ways in which technology changes our relationship with the self. Perhaps one of the most powerful ways is the invention of the mirror and reflective surfaces, where you have this reflective surface that helps you to see yourself as others see you. And then suddenly that becomes the first thing you look at every morning to see how you look, to be preoccupied with how you're appearing to others. And that becomes constitutive of your sense of self. And social media and the virtual space of the internet is a new technology of the self, a context in which we're increasingly coming to an understanding of ourselves through this projection of a representation of the self that's very artificial, that is in a virtual space, and it's something that is reciprocal. There's a sort of reciprocal relationship between us and it, where we project ourselves out, but then see ourselves as it's reflected back to us. And we define ourselves in terms of how we appear to ourselves and to others in that space of mutual display. And as a result, we've lost something of the richness of the internal self that you'd have in the age of diaries and print media as the primary form of media. And we've also lost something of the thickness of the self that you'd have in the previous more verbal age of speech and an oral society. And what's happened is we've replaced this with a fixation on how we appear. And it's one of the reasons why I think people are a lot more concerned with the representation of particular groups and demographics within a piece of literature than they are with the psychological development of the characters nowadays.
Right, right. Yeah, you mentioned thickness, and Hans Ruckmacher, actually going back to Bob Dylan's Ballad of a Thin Man, you know something's happening, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? But he talks about thinness and how we've become thin people, ghost-like, almost. We, in a sense, have indeed become our avatars, and our avatars are made for us. In between the mirror and the digital world is the photograph. And I noticed something back in the 1980s, that I had a friend, and she showed me her photo album back in the day when people would share photo albums, and which I think is still a good thing, by the way. But she showed me all her photos of herself and her sister and stuff. Everyone, there were only two modes. It was either she was laughing or she was goofy. And I thought, this is how you see yourself. So I said to her, look, can I take a picture of you where you don't smile? Just because you are actually this person quite often. You aren't this person, but that goes with the avatar, so now we have those apps that will change your appearance in Instagram to make you more perfect or more, what's the word, imaginative, more, well, this is where we start getting into the problems of not only gender, but species, where you have people who, want to be, essentially, I think so much of what we see is people wanting to be images and not to be thick. One thing I've learned over time is, to be a thicker person, pretty thick the way it is, but, to be thick in your character and soul, well, it does take time, but it also takes a willingness to simply stand and take what life throws at you, and not to find a way out, not to blame the rest of the world. And you can always find somebody to blame, but also not to get, my life doesn't come from the digital world. I do read, you'll notice up there, there's some paintings. Those are actually paintings that I bought here in Georgia off the streets. I want to say, Ruckmacher talks about, he was talking about a book of art. I think it was Hans Jensen's book of art history. But he was saying, you open it up and you see all these photographs of art, and you think you've seen the art. And he says, you haven't. If you want to see the Night Watch, you have to go to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and you have to look and look and look. And it takes hours to study that painting, because it's like reading a book by Jane Austen. It's not a simple thing. And I think that one of the problems that we've been having, and I think it's come to a boil politically, is that these thin people, influenced by propaganda, influenced by people who know what they desire, people creating those desires, and not having the character, not having the density to be able to simply go, no, I'm not going to go along with you on all of the whatever. It could be left or right. It really doesn't matter. It's following the herd. It's the digital herd. It's this, again, my screen here is very flat. And because it's flat, my world becomes flat, if that's all I have. I mean, I think one of the reasons people live in just kind of like in America, people just walk in, oh, white walls, great, because they're not going to be looking at the walls anyway. It's not like it's going to have, I notice you've got some nice wooden shelves and a wooden dresser behind you. And
mostly I fill all of my walls, any that the house will support. Oh, exactly. I'm worried about the structural integrity at this point. I fill them with shelves.
I'm trying to get my library from Alaska to here, and I had to find a place, like I said, super thick walls. And it was big enough. And I said, as soon as I found it, 11-foot ceilings, 12-foot ceilings, I said, perfect. It's going to hold it, because I've got also a lot of vinyl records and a ton of books. I noticed you've got all those I assume those are all commentaries behind you.
Almost all commentaries. Yeah. I've got more in the other room.
But what do you think about, we've entered this zone that just seems, well, some people think it's, the worst of all times. I'm sitting there saying, well, you evidently don't know anything about World War II, and yet people have the
Black
feeling.
Death was pretty bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yet you have the feeling that this is really bad. And as a result, people are, they're up in arms. They're led by their the avatars of others who all kind of group together. And I see dark possibilities here, and I see, but also light possibilities. I think the fact that we're talking together is a good thing. And like I said, if that's all there was to it, then okay, that's limited. But nevertheless, it's better than us spewing hatred at each other for whatever. Yep. I can't see a reason to do that. But this is what people are doing when they find someone they disagree with. I don't see anything I particularly disagree with. I'm sure if we talk long enough, we go like, really, you think that? But that's everybody. But what do you think about where we are? What these times are? We've entered this zone. I think we're coming out of the pandemic zone, but still, I think a lot of damage was done in that period. So what is your thoughts about?
I think one instance that I think of when you talk about thin people and the way in which we can be captured by images, I think just of the phenomena, particularly of Tumblr and the way that it formed people through preoccupation with the sharing of images that were ways of expressing themselves, and how that particular community encouraged anorexia first and then transgender identities, particularly with people identifying with really weird fetish images or images that were just unhuman in some ways, but ways of escaping the physicality that was more immediate to them and identifying with some imaginative image on the screen that eventually captivated them to the extent that they wanted to transform their body to mirror that. And so the body itself becomes the mirror of some virtual reality that exists outside of it. I think we can all experience this on different levels. There are some people who don't feel that they fully had an experience until the photos of that experience have been shared and liked on social media. You need to actually have that validation of the experience for it really to count. And so that experience of being disconnected, it feels like a sort of small death. You've been cut off from the realm where your personhood would actually register. It's like the experience of being banned from seeing your face in a mirror. You'd find that traumatic after a while because you realize you've come to depend upon seeing your face, and that's become part of how you see yourself. And without that, suddenly you find yourself floundering. It's like people who are put in a situation where they can't talk with other people for a period of time. They find themselves disoriented because so much of their self is found in that space of conversation, almost where they can't catch their own eye in solitude. And that question then, I think, the question that this raises for us is, how can we use these modern technologies in a way that is shaped by an understanding of healthy formation of the self? So, for instance, I think the development of the modern world towards private reading was a very good thing. It enabled for the development of selves in solitude and a calmness in thinking about things that you couldn't have so much in the ancient world. You could think about ideas by detaching yourself a bit more from the context where they're really live and there's these antagonisms around them. You could weigh them up as you read the page, and you invited that page into your world. It wasn't necessarily something that imposed itself upon you. And as a result, your mind could be formed in a calmer place. And then when you came into the realm of dispute and argument, your mind was not so caught up and stifled within that realm that you couldn't actually distinguish ideas from it. I think that's one of the struggles within the contemporary world, where so much of our reading and our thinking occurs in the charged social spaces of online media and connected media, where we're constantly thinking about how does this register in terms of these relationships, and the word is no longer latent anymore, but it has an activity to it that makes it very difficult for us to detach what someone is saying from what they are meaning to do by what they are saying, or how they are aligning, or what they are signaling. And that struggle, I think, is one that we really need to undertake for our psychological and spiritual health and well-being. We need to recover a self that is not captivated by the spectacle. And that spectacle takes many different forms. It's not always the image on the screen. It can be the social spectacle. It can be the way in which things are on the big screen, or it can be the way that things are on the second screen, where we're increasingly, those things that are happening on the big screen, we're playing off the second screen of our devices and our computers and things like that, where we're increasingly, for instance, the politics of what is seen on the big screen. You want to see yourself reflected back. And so you can't just suspend yourself and go into an imaginative place and engage with the story in its own terms. Somehow it has to serve the political purpose of reflecting yourself back to you. And as a result, I think we're ending up as these thinner people that you describe. And that, I'm not sure that we can escape this as a society. As on a social level, I think it's an almost inexorable tendency that comes with the media. On an individual level, I think we can resist it, and we must.
Yes, and I think that we are, well, Jacques Ellul talks about technology, and he talks about propaganda, and he talks about being alone in the mass. And I don't think he would at all be surprised by our online worlds these days, because that's what we are. We're alone, but yet we're communicating with many people beyond us, in our social media, which has become almost ubiquitous. Most people these days have some sort of social media that they keep up with. And I think that it's like a trap. And societally, everything that's new that comes along, it's almost impossible for the masses to reject it. Then by the masses, that could be the richest or the poorest or whoever. Actually, the poorest sometimes are better off because they can't afford all the latest iPhones and such. They end up in a zone that's below propaganda on some level. But at the same time, I think that you're right. Individually, there are answers. Ellul's answer at the end of his book, The Technological Bluff, he says, do you think we're really going to win this great warfare we're in, this environment we have found ourselves in? He goes, no. If you think you're going to, have a revolution that'll get everything set back on its feet, no, it's not going to happen. And that's especially true, I think, when we think about social justice, the environment, when we think about all these things. Yes, things need to be done. But when people, have this kind of utopian view that all we need to do is get everyone to think the same way, no, that's not going to happen. And it'll lead us to even more and more darker forms of technological enslavement in order to get that going. However, he uses the phrase, he says, however, we have never seen a system that completely covers everything. There's always what he calls cracks of freedom. And it's in those cracks of freedom that we have to install the good things that people are waiting for. I think right now, the fact that we can have a conversation like this shows that, at least for a while, someplace like YouTube is a crack of freedom that we can do something with. Now, in 10, 15 years, maybe it'll be totally different. Maybe, but something else will be there if we're keeping our eyes open and our ears and our hearts open. You know, some people will probably want to do other things. You know, they will. What I encourage people to do is I say it's not enough to do them online. You've got to bring something back into your daily reality. You know, you've got to, you know, I mean, people say, I want to change, you know, our approach to the environment. And my thought is, okay, you're talking a good talk, I suppose, but have you ever, you know, spent time in a garden? Do you know what, you know, if you're not connected to your own geographic specificity, do you know anything about an environment? Or is it all just words? You know, I think, you know, there are degrees of mediation, you know, and some things have many, many more degrees of mediation, you know, but if I'm, you know, when I was in Alaska and I had a garden, if I'm out there with a tool, the only really degree of mediation is maybe I've got to go buy some plant seeds and I've got a little garden spade that I'm using. But then I've got my hands directly in the dirt and I'm pulling out the weeds and I'm directly dealing with it. It's the same with animals. You know, I've worked with goats and chickens and pigs and things, and you get a totally different view of the world by dealing directly with the thing. And so my encouragement to people is always, okay, you're getting some ideas. That's really good. You're maybe meeting clusters of people. Now, can you get, is there anybody near you where you live? You know, is there anything you can do? Do you have a backyard you can change? You know, Peterson's go clean up your room, your bedroom or whatever. That's actually really good on the level of touching things. Yep. That's why puppetry is important to me, because it's all about tactility. And that is the antidote. It is tactile things that are the antidote to so much of our world. Well, so for instance, there was a guy here in Georgia when I first came here. His name is Sandro, and he is about 25 years old, university student. I don't find any postmodern people here, which is very interesting. I mean, it's a modern. I mean, it's, you know, big. There's skyscrapers. People have cell phones. They go to Marvel movies, but there are no geeks. There are no people slavishly committed to the Star Wars universe. There's, you know, people don't live for these things in the same way as they do back in the States. So, but my friend Sandro, he saw that I was already picking up Georgian art books, and also I was getting a few books sent to me from Amazon, and I was telling him about my big library and that I had to get it here. And he was kind of like, well, why do you want to do that? You can get everything on the internet. And I said, it's not the same. And then I would just show him a book that I picked up, or, you know, a new copy of the Iliad that I had that was better than the one I had before. And then a few months later, he said, you know, I've started picking up books. I said, excellent. Because it's something about how, you know, it's like, yeah, you can get all these files downloaded to your computer, or in the case of most Georgians, you know, bootlegged and stolen and put on your computer. But it doesn't matter. What matters is when you see the book sitting on a shelf that calls to you, you need to read me. You know, you spent money on me. You know, it's like, I'm here, do something with me. It's the tactility of it, which is so important. And I think there is hope in these little clusters of people who are talking, and, you know, maybe someone will hear something we're doing and find something there, you know.
I think you're absolutely right. I've found podcasts and YouTube to be a place to recover conversation that you often won't find in other contexts. Now, I always want to, as you say, to bring these things into actual real life. And at this point, last I counted, I've met up with over 250 people that I first interacted with online. I've met in person subsequently. I see the internet very much as, at the moment, there are people working on my house on the roof, and there's scaffolding all around it, and it enables them to do things on the house that they would not be able to do otherwise. It enables them to get on the roof safely and to move things up and down, and it enables the structure of the house to be improved. But the internet can be like that. You don't want to live in the scaffolding. But if you have the scaffolding, you can do a lot to improve the structure if you're using it wisely. Unfortunately, the very structure seems, or the nature of the internet seems to encourage the unwise use of it, which is a struggle that we have. We have to resist that. But along with that, I do find there's this challenge to be people that are able to step back from the spectacle, from being defined by that, to be people who find a center of gravity elsewhere. And I've found some of the things that have really shocked me to a sense of just how detached I've can become is looking at old technologies. And the technology of the book has always especially fascinated me. At the start of my PhD studies in Durham, I was looking at old Bibles that preceded print, and looking at these Bibles, seeing just how remarkable they were. And you think about the amount of animals that were needed to produce, even a Gutenberg Bible needed 180 calves to produce one Gutenberg Bible. Mm-hmm. And then you have the fact that, for instance, books in the northeast of England were of good quality because we have lots of rain, which means healthy sheep and skins that won't tear when you stretch them. And there's a whole culture, there's a book has a place to it. A particular community with scribal practices that is expressed within that physical artifact. That artifact has a unique history. It has a genealogy. It's descended from other texts that have informed it as it's been copied out into them. Now, our modern books, even though they're great things, and I'm very much in favor of the physical book, our modern books are much diminished from what that sort of book would be. Mm-hmm. But we can make them our own. I've looking at, picked up a couple of volumes last week on moral theology in Latin. And on just about every second page, this person on very thin paper has written out their notes in the most exquisite handwriting. And they've been translating the Latin or writing their own reflections. And it's a unique object as a result. Right. It's something incredibly beautiful. And we can do that with our books. We can hand them down and give them to people as gifts. A book can be a channel of the weight of the world and its meanings in a way that you can't give someone a digital book in quite the same way as you can give them a physical copy of a book. Right. And so where possible, trying to pursue these things that give thickness and weight to our worlds, trying to be people that find the center of our gravity within these realms. And we need to engage with other people, which will require going online and interacting with people with devices. But if we do that from a context where our identities are not formed primarily there, I think we'll do it in a far healthier way. And one of the challenges for me has always been to overcome the drive to become preoccupied with ideology, because ideology is a sort of abstraction that is encouraged by the spectacle, because you can't connect, if you're not connecting with things in a very particular concretizing, localized way, you'll end up connecting with them in terms of these grand ideologies and symbols. And so any specific story becomes a symbol of this grand narrative, or it becomes a symbol of, for instance, of oppressive government, or a symbol of the patriarchy, or a symbol of the resistance, whatever it is, this big floppy symbol, that ideology that gathers all things under it and reduces them. But yet when we engage in the local and the particular, we find that things are so much more than ideologies could ever present them as being. And so my concern has been to be someone who roots myself very deeply in things that aren't ideological. And so, for instance, in the last 2 years, I've been spending my time, the vast majority of my time, producing a chapter by chapter commentary on the whole Bible that's focused upon paying attention to the text, listening to it on its own terms, and putting the debates that we're having to one side. And then when I speak into those debates, hopefully I'm speaking from a groundedness in the reality itself, not within the spectacle.
Right. And I was going to mention this before. I think we've come to a nice place where we can start winding down here. I was going to mention you've been working through, if you go to Alastair's channel, he's been working through the entire Bible with, what are they, about 25-minute videos, something like that.
25 to 30, yep.
Yeah, and it's a lectionary. Would you describe what a lectionary is? So
a lectionary is a cycle of readings that takes you through the text of Scripture over a period of time. So the one that I'm using has morning and evening readings of Old and New Testament. And over the course of a year, you're working through most of the Bible. There are certain passages that are missed out, but the majority of the text is covered. And so I've used that as the template for doing a complete commentary, audio commentary on the whole Bible. And the purpose of it is to be free and easily accessible and available to anyone, anywhere. And it can be searched. You can find a particular passage and find my thoughts on that. Right. But I've spent probably in the first year about 9 hours per day, and then the second year about 7 hours per day, just reading lots and lots of commentaries on the subject. And it's been immensely rewarding.
Well,
it is
riches what he's done is quite remarkable. And I know there are people on my channel who have wanted to know more about how to read the Bible, a way to read it. And I think if you go over to Alastair's channel and simply look, let's say you're interested in Matthew or John, or you're interested in the book of Genesis or Exodus or Proverbs, if you look, you'll see that he's probably done a good number of those things. Like I said, what are you missing?
There are some sections of Leviticus, Numbers, Joshua, the very end of the book of Judges, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, some passages that overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, and then some passages in Ezekiel.
Right.
Those are the main things. I'm finishing off the Psalms.
Yeah, so those are probably worth reading, but they're not the critical texts of the Bible. And again, so if you're curious about the Bible and want to have someone kind of help you through it, Alastair's your man. So do that. Also, and do go over to his channel. He did a great interview that I just listened to with Jake Meador, who is in charge of, what's the magazine he does?
Mere Orthodoxy.
Yeah, Mere Orthodoxy.
And he has a common connection with with Labrie.
Yes. So there's connections going all around here. So anyway, I've enjoyed talking with you, and I hope we do this again sometime. And
thank you very much for the invitation. It's been
No, I've appreciated your ideas, and I am on my way to Prague to make what originally started as kind of a digital exploration, a much more real than it. I've been there this will be the 6th time, and I'll be there for 3 weeks. And by this time, I've got friends in different fields, and also I'm very connected with people who do puppetry there. And the woman who is the editor of Lotkarsh, which is the oldest puppetry magazine in the world. And they want to, I've been doing interviews with puppeteers on some of the subjects of reality besides just puppetry as well. They are almost all uniformly, saying, no, the thing, the puppet is the important thing. Even the people who make, like Jan Schwenkmeyer and the Quay brothers, who make digital films, it's the texture that is important. And so they're going to, the editor there wants to make a book out of all my interviews. So I'm going to talk with her about how that might work. So it should be a nice thing. So actually, this interview will probably come out in a couple of weeks while I'm on my trip to Prague. So, but I'll keep an eye on it. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off in a moment. And thank you, Alastair. I appreciated your being with us here on the Anadromist. And remember, folks, Anadromist is a word that means swimming against the stream like salmon do, trying to get home. So do that.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.